So you can see in that video why it is that um, a winner-take-all election system or first past the post makes it so difficult for third parties to attract candidates, to attract voters, and generally to break into the election system, puts them at a pretty severe disadvantage. Now, I just want to show you, I want to talk about the contrast with a proportional election system, which is used in many countries in the world. Let me just show you quickly. This is a sample of some of the countries, democratic countries in the world. These are countries with majoritarian or first past the post or winner take all systems like we do. And this is on the x-axis is the number of effective political parties that are produced in the system. And you can see that we are the one with only two. But other countries that have similar election systems also have very few. Canada gets away with having a couple more than that because they have what are called regional parties by political scientists. So they have some political parties that are very successful in particular regions of the country. So for instance, their Parti Québécois, but they're not very successful nationwide. So effectively, they do have other political parties. And down here are proportional systems, and there are lots of other things that happen as well. I talk about these in my other class, my comparative politics class. But these are the proportional systems, and you can see that they have, by contrast, many more political parties. So let's talk about how a proportional system works. In a proportional electoral system, the kind of the purest example of this is Israel. In Israel, there are 160 seats in their parliament or legislative body, which is called the Knesset. And when you go to vote, you vote for a party. The candidates are not listed. And the parties select the candidates. The parties select the people that they'd like to see seated in the parliament. And then people go to vote, and let's say Party A gets 25% of the votes. Well, then they get 25% of the seats. If they get 10%, 10% of the seats, and so forth. And so there's great incentives to form and to run with small parties because even parties that draw a relatively small percentage of the electorate are able to win at least some seats. In our system, of course, if you win 10% of the votes, you don't get any representation at all. And so this is a very good explanation. And so again, just to look at this one more time, you can see that systems with proportional electoral systems tend to have many more parties. And we've had plenty of third parties during the course of the country's history. We know that there are two pretty well-known third-party candidates in the presidential election right now, but third parties don't tend to have very much success. There have been moments when they have. So, for instance, when the Democratic Party became a major party, and the Whig Party and the Republican Party. It doesn't happen very often. And so what I want to do now then is talk about some of this, the history. But before I do that, I want to just kind of discuss how this ends up working. In a proportional system, if no party wins a majority, then what happens is that in order to govern, the parties have to what's called form a coalition amongst themselves so that they can govern. So they have to form a coalition, an agreement between more than one political party that equals more than 50% of the electoral body. And in that kind of a system, parties disappear pretty quickly. They disappear rather than adapt to changing voter interest because new parties can attract support fairly easily. So people don't have any particular reason to stick with a party that was promoting ideas that are not popular with the electorate anymore. In a two-party system, though, what happens is that the coalitioning or the agreement among different groups of voters happens before the election, so that each party represents a wide range of voters. And then over time, what happens is that the parties adapt to the changing interests of the voters by changing their platforms, rather than switching to a new party. People that have the same old party label end up running under different platforms and different interests. And this is, in our country's history, that's how third parties have had an effect. They tend to push the major parties to adopt things in their platform that they might not have otherwise. So for instance, a good example right now is Hillary Clinton saying that she's going to oppose the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And she's pushed to do that certainly by Bernie Sanders and his supporters. The Democratic Party platform itself was redrawn with Bernie supporters. So this is what happens quite often. If you go back just a little bit before this, 1992, when Ross Perot runs for the presidency, he won 19% of the popular vote. He didn't win any electoral college votes. And what the issues that he was running on had to do with budgetary responsibility at the federal level. Now, what happens after that election is that both of the major two parties start talking about budgetary responsibility at the federal level. And so they kind of take out this, I think about this giant vacuum and sort of vacuum up all of the voters who had been attracted to Ross Perot's party and draw them into the major two parties. This is what tends to happen. The other issue is that quite often third parties focus on the presidency when probably what they should be doing is focusing on legislative elections and even local elections. Those are places where they might be able to break in at a relatively lower cost, and where the spoiler effect is not seen as quite so dramatic as it is in the presidential election. Now, so let me talk about some of these changing coalitions. In political science and American politics, we often call this periods of realignment. And realignments are times when the major two parties have changed the size and the composition of the voters that support them, the issues that they're standing for. And eventually this results in a change in the voter ID of the populace. And this kind of an event often happens when there's some kind of a crisis or some kind of new issue or old issues fade away. It doesn't happen very often, and you can see here when we talk about realignments, we're usually referring to just this handful of elections that I want to talk about a little bit now. And I want to use electoral college maps to see how this has happened, and also to think about how voters have what we might call resorted themselves to respond to new and changing party platforms over time. All right, so let me begin to show you some of these electoral college maps. We can start with, so this is obvious, these are electoral college maps. They're looking at the presidential elections. So it's a fairly, limited way of discussing this, but I think it's fairly useful. Let's see, my computer is taking a little bit of time to reset. And the first two maps that you'll see are maps in the first two elections after the Constitution is drawn up, when George Washington is selected unanimously as the first president. And so you can see these maps. They're fairly, there's, everybody in the country, all of the electors selecting Washington in these first two maps. And when Washington leaves office, he famously warns everybody in the country, don't form yourself into political parties. Vote for the best person. And then very quickly, they do the opposite, right? Form political parties. And those first two sets of parties, we sometimes call the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republicans. Different labels are used during this early period. They begin to organize themselves into sets of issues and into reliable supporters of those issues. You might take a look at the 1820 election. The 1820 election is almost unanimous. It's one of those that maybe George Washington would have liked. Almost the entire set of electors voted for Monroe. This is what historians sometimes call the era of good feelings. And then that era of good feelings is quickly replaced by this election, which is one of the most divisive elections in the country's history. There are 4 people that run for office. You can see that sort of anachronistically, they're all called Democratic Republicans. They didn't really use a party label. They were still thinking that parties were not really polite or the right way to go about things. They were essentially all 4 running as individuals. And so you can see a very divided electorate, a very divided electoral college. Nobody wins outright in the electoral college. And so the House votes. Now, when the House votes, there is what's called the corrupt bargain. Adams is selected as the president. Henry Clay's supporters support Adams, even though Jackson won the most popular votes. Now, Jackson is pretty upset about this, and he vows that this is not going to happen to him again. He's going to run again, and next time he's going to win. Now, Jackson is worth spending a little bit more time talking about. He was really the first person to run for office who was not from the propertied classes. He had been born very poor, was orphaned, made his name as a military hero. He was sort of uncouth. He didn't really fit in very well. And this may have played a role in what happened in that House election in 1824. Now, when he decides to run again, he says, I'm going to do this differently this time, and I'm going to try to get as many people to vote for me as possible. And so they begin to do what's called grassroots mobilization, trying to win by getting as many people to vote as possible. A lot of people who had never voted in presidential elections before, and certainly the people that wrote the Constitution didn't really think should be participating in the presidential election. He and his supporters purchased newspapers and started running stories about how the election was stolen from him and he was a military hero. They started holding campaign events. They would go out and hold parties with roasted pigs and kegs of beer and say, come on out and join the Jacksonian Democrats. And they were trying to get people to identify with this organization called the Democratic Party, which is something that had never been done before. And in fact, it was so innovative that we call this period the period of Jacksonian democracy. It's essentially the birth of the modern political party. And it's very effective. Jackson does manage to win the next election pretty handily. And he wins the one after that as well. He wins in 1828 and in 1832. And then his vice president wins in 1836, so they hold on to the presidency again. Now, around that time, an opposition party emerges, and this party called itself the Whig Party, which was an anti-royalist party in British history. So they were saying they were running against King Jackson, and this is represented by the purple color here. So you can see it in the 1836 election, and then by the 1840 election, they managed to win the presidency. And they managed to win the presidency because they're doing all of the same things that the Democrats were doing. Essentially, they are uh, holding national party conventions. So these are some other innovations that Jackson brought to the system after his 1828 win. The spoils system, he's giving jobs to supporters. Also during this time, people's ideas about the electoral system change so that many state laws are changed so that all white males can vote instead of only about 40% of white males. Many white males were excluded because of property qualifications. And so this new Whig party is doing all of the same things. So you can see here, this is a poster advertising a great Whig meeting, a mass meeting during the 1836 election. And when they win in 1840, it's with the same tactics. Now, what's really interesting about this is to look at voter turnout rates. And I'm going to go back to the last slide. I'm going to type in right here voter turnout rates in these elections. This is the turnout of the eligible electorate that voted in that. So only 10% of eligible voters voted during that early election. And in this election, it was only 27% of the eligible electorate. And that we're talking 27% of 40% of white voters. So we're not talking about very many people participating in these elections. Now, if you shift to the 1826 to 1828 election, which is the first election that Jackson wins with these new strategies, turnout in that election is 53% of the eligible electorate. So he almost doubles the percent of the eligible electorate that turns out. By the time we get to 1840, when both sides are doing this, turnout is 80%. So this is really part of what Jacksonian democracy is all about. It's about expanding the electorate. It's about bringing more people into the electoral process. Now, was a transition to a new party system, essentially, one that included the Democratic Party and the Whig Party. By the 1850s, a new issue has come into the public eye, or it's been there for a while, but the tension around slavery has grown pretty dramatically. The Whig Party can't figure out what kind of a platform to adopt. It's quite a divided party, and they can't come to any conclusion about what to say about slavery. And so because slavery is the most important issue before the voters at this point, this is a terrible disadvantage for anybody that's going to run as a Whig. And so both candidates and voters begin to shop around for a new political party. And they find one that's called the Republican Party, which has adopted a platform that includes a call for the gradual elimination of slavery. They participate in the 1856 election, and then by 1860 they actually win the election. And part of the reason that they win the election in 1860 is because the Democratic Party has split itself into a southern portion and a northern portion. The Democratic Party is the party of the slaveholders, and in both the southern and the northern parts, they're arguing that slavery should be legal, with some variation in how much freedom states should have to choose their institution of slavery. And Lincoln manages to win that election with only about 40% of the popular vote because of that split in the electorate. But he wins in the Electoral College, and of course, right after that, um, states in the South begin very quickly to secede from the Union, and you can see the next maps for the next couple of elections. You go to 1864. This is all gray um, because the South is seceded and they're not part of the Union at this point. So the election, of course, is almost unanimously in favor of the Republican Party in 1864. 1865, the war comes to a close. In 1868, many of the states that had seceded from the Union have rejoined, and you can see that during this period, right after the Civil War, what we call Reconstruction, many of the states, even in the South, are voting Republican. Now, this should be a surprise to you because the Republican Party was just the party that had won the war over the South, and they had were seen as by many Southern people, as white people, as having really destroyed their way of life. And so the fact that the Republican Party is winning in the South during this period um, is partly because of the policies of Reconstruction that were actually guaranteeing the right to vote for African Americans during this period. So Union soldiers, I should say, United States government soldiers stayed in the South as a part of Reconstruction for a number of years, and there were many African Americans elected even to Congress during this period. Many whites that were holding government offices in the Confederate government were not allowed to vote. And the other side of it, of course, is that I was going to say this kind of surprise about the fact that the Republicans are winning in the South during this period. In 1876, in the election of 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes runs, and part of his platform is that he will end Reconstruction. There's a sense in the country among the white Northerners that they're kind of tired of supporting the the continued occupation of the South, and they would like to sort of reunify and sort of make up with the people in the Southern political structure. And so when he runs in 1876, it's a very close election. He ends up winning, and he does end Reconstruction. And you can see what happens very quickly after that. The South votes overwhelmingly for the Democratic Party. This is because, on the one hand, the white power structure has returned to the South once the Reconstruction has ended and the North is no longer stationing troops in the South. The white power structure reemerges. And we've already talked also about the emergence of Jim Crow, restrictions on voting rights of African Americans. And so it's not surprising that the Democratic Party becomes the most loyal voting bloc the Southern states become the most loyal voting bloc for the Democratic Party for many decades after that. You can see Democrat, 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 Democratic, Democratic all the way through the beginning of the 20th century. And this is partly because white people in the South, will not vote for Republicans. The Republican Party is hated in the South. And so you can see right through the 1930s and during this period of Republican dominance in the country. Almost the only voting bloc left for the Democratic Party is the South. Now, if we move forward to this period, right, what happens between here and here is the Great Depression. And so this is the next realignment that I want you to think about. Let me switch back to the slides. So here's the third party system. Democrats and the Republicans emerge as a new party, they first win the presidency in 1860. So it's important for you to know the Democratic Party first won the presidency in 1828, and the Republican Party first won the presidency in 1860. And since then, they've been the two major parties in our system. Now, like I said, the Republican Party was dominant in most of the country from the Civil War through the beginning of the 20th century. But the Great Depression shook this up. When Roosevelt runs in 1932 as a Democrat, he wins with the promise of, in the party platform, of bringing a federal government role into managing the economy and also into providing some kind of relief from the Great Depression. And let me just switch back real fast so we can see visually just how striking that election was. Almost night to day, from almost the entire country voting Republican in one election to the entire country voting Democratic in the next election. Now, you have to have a pretty deep shakeup in the political party system in order for something like that to happen. And we call this the New Deal coalition. And so let's talk about what the elements of the New Deal coalition. It includes, of course, two elements that were already parts of the Democratic coalition. Southern whites, again, won't vote for Republicans because Republicans are the party of Lincoln, which destroyed their way of life. And so the Democratic Party trying very hard not to alienate Southern whites. Machine politicians as well, Democrats in the North. Democrats had gained a foothold in the North by representing the interests of industrial workers through setting up basically patronage systems. And so they were already, many of these were already Democrats. They drew in Republicans as well, who, for the same reason that white Southerners would not vote Republican, many African Americans would not vote Republican. Would not vote Democratic, because the Democratic Party had been the party of the slaveholders. But with the Great Depression, Northern African Americans were brought to vote for the Democratic Party. So were progressives. Many progressives had come out of the Republican Party. Theodore Roosevelt ran as a Republican, but also as a progressive. And so they are a new part of the New Deal coalition. And then two other groups, industrial workers who had been split between the Democratic and the Republican Party, and also farmers, who were mostly Democrats, also were brought into the New Deal coalition, all for different reasons, coming into being a part of the coalition for different reasons, different motivations, right? And this lasts for some time, through the 1950s. But in the 1950s, the issues begin to shift. The parties stay the same, but the issues begin to shift. Once the New Deal itself, the policies like Social Security and federal regulation of the economy, those are no longer really contested by Republicans, and so they are no longer really a point of contention between the Democrats and the Republican Party. But what does remain is division over the scope of federal power. That does remain. And Republicans are arguing and have argued since then for less federal power and Democrats have supported expanded federal power. But this wasn't enough to kind of satisfy voters who started thinking about other kinds of questions, and also candidates looking for other kinds of issues. So, for instance, Democratic politicians looking for new voters and for ways to really attract voters and get them passionate about their candidacy begin to support the issue of civil rights. They have two new parts of their coalition, Northern African Americans and also progressives who are interested in civil rights issues. And so once they start pushing those issues, they can actually win. When they do that, they begin to alienate Southern Democrats. So there's, for a very long time, a division within the Democratic Party between Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats that begins to emerge during this period. But also the Republican Party, looking for also an issue that can attract different parts of the electorate, begin to organize themselves around issues of social conservatism, like the issue of especially abortion, and the rights of people who want to practice their religion in public schools and things like that. These are very important issues in the 1960s and in the 1970s. And those are attractive to white Southerners. And so they begin to make inroads in the South that they couldn't before, that they had not been able to since the Civil War. So putting all of this together leads to the election of Nixon in 1968 with the Republican Party. And it sets up the coalitions that we still see today. So it's the most recent of the realignments. So let me show you how this looks. So here's the Democratic Party still hanging on, the New Deal coalition, all through the 1940s. And you can see here, especially in the 1948 election and the 1968 election, Southern states are beginning, voters in the Southern states are beginning to react to the adoption of civil rights platforms by the National Democratic Party and are supporting third-party candidates. So in this 1948 election, you can see Strom Thurmond. The party was called the States Rights Democratic Party. It's essentially a segregationist party, and actually wins electoral college votes in the 1948 election, and in the 1968 election as well. Part of the reason that Nixon ends up winning in 1968 is because the Democratic Party loses the South to George Wallace, who's running under the guise of the American Independent Party. It's not the only reason. I mean, I think Nixon would have won anyway, but this was kind of a signal that something's going very awry in the Democratic Party coalition, right? Now, and then you can see in 1972, this is the first election since the Civil War that the South votes Republican. Today, the South is, in many cases, very Republican. They've made inroads into the South, and you can see in the next elections coming through the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, and in this year's election as well, the importance of this shift of white Southerners to the Republican Party to the presidential elections. What's another thing that's pretty interesting to say about this is that the transition takes place very slowly. For instance, our party system, let me just flip to that. I'm going to start talking about the party organization at this point. The organization of the party system is fairly non-hierarchical. It's very decentralized. Local party organizations do not answer to national party in any way. They can run candidates that are completely opposed to the national party if they want to, and that's very different than the way that political party organizations work in other systems. What this means is that for a very long time in the South, you had people running as Democrats, the Democratic Party, who were essentially what we call Dixiecrats. They were old-time Democrats, Democrats that were very socially conservative and opposed to civil rights even until fairly recently. Let me just, and that didn't produce any problems because the parties are not coordinated at the national and the local level. So let me just give you an example of this. When last year, when the Supreme Court legalized gay marriage and said that states had to perform gay marriages, couldn't outlaw gay marriage, one of the county clerks, I don't know if you remember this, one of the county clerks refused to perform gay marriages. And there was this big uproar in the country about that and what to do about that. One piece of the story that didn't get very much attention is that she was a Democrat, right? And she was a Democrat because her parents were Democrats and her parents' parents were Democrats, and the Democratic Party in her small town functioned like it used to, or it represented the kinds of interests or policies that the Democratic Party had represented for a very, very long time in the South. After that whole rigmarole and people in the national press said, wait, why is she a Democrat? She actually changed her party identification to the Republican Party. And so these things do change very slowly. So sometimes we see the change at the national level in the presidential election before we see it, long, long before we see it at the local level. And the change of the South to the Republican Party has really only been fairly complete and widespread since 2012, since the 2010-2012 election. So these things change very slowly. Now, I want to talk about party and government now. So if you remember one of these earlier slides, I said I'm going to be talking about these different aspects of our party system. So I've talked about the two-party system, and I've taken you through some of the history of our two-party system and how they've changed over time, and how the Republican Party has essentially, changed pretty dramatically from the kinds of policies it used to advocate when it first came online. When Lincoln was president, of course, the Republican Party freed the slaves and was in favor of a very strong federal government, one strong enough to go to war and force states to come back into the Union. And today, the Republican Party is the party of state power. It's the party that stands for conservative, socially conservative issues. And the same thing with the transition of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party, beginning in 1828 and all the way up until the 1930s, well, really until the 1950s, was either the party of slaveholders or a party that was against the rights of minorities like African Americans. And it was also the party of states' rights. And so today, the Democratic Party is the party that advocates in favor often of a stronger federal government, and also is the party that was the mechanism for gaining civil rights, first for African Americans, and today for groups like LGBT and also of women. And so our party system allows for this kind of adaptability and change over time. Now, so let me shift back to what I was going to talk about, shifting from party organization to the party and government. When we say party and government, of course, we're talking about how does the party work among elected officials? How does it work in the act of governing? We know that party labels are very important for elections, but our election system really is what we call a candidate-centered election system. Uh, it's not run by parties. Political parties really don't have any direct control over the campaign process. That's controlled by individual campaigns. And the transition for this has been a long one. There are lots of reforms that were put in place. Many of these reforms were advocated for by the Progressive Party around the turn of the century that thought that parties were too strong and that voters weren't able to have true representation as long as parties were kind of pulling the strings behind the scenes. And so they instituted reforms that weakened parties over time. One of the first of these is what we call civil service reform, getting rid of Jackson's original policies of patronage, of giving jobs to supporters, undermining the machine politics that was taking place in many of the large cities in the latter part of the 19th century. And this begins first at the federal level with what's called the Pendleton Act in 1883, and then spreads to state governments. This weakens parties, of course, because if a party can give you a job in exchange for your support, it's going to be then of course you're going to support the party, or it's going to be more difficult to get large groups of people to not support whatever it is that the party wants. Another part of this reform was the secret ballot, the introduction of the secret ballot. It used to be the case that the way that voting would take place is there would be this big box sitting on the table, and everybody would come in and be standing around, people from the candidates' campaigns, or from the party, I should say, standing around watching this box, and they could see who would put ballots into the box. There was one box for one party, another box for another party in some cases, and so you could see who put the ballot, and you'd know if they voted for you or not. And then if they voted for your party, then you could give them a job or get their brother a job or their cousin or whatever. And so secret ballot was really important in breaking this bond between people who were using the patronage system and the political parties. We also saw a weakening of the parties when we shifted to primary elections as opposed to parties choosing their own candidates. The way it works in our system with primary elections, individuals declare themselves a candidate of a party. In some states, they have to be a member of a party, maybe for a year or something like that. But the parties don't really have any direct say over who's going to run as a candidate for their party. It's the voters that end up picking. Now, of course, party labels are important, and organizational help is important. So if you're well known to the party, it's going to be a little bit easier for you. But this is quite different than a system like in the UK. They have very party-controlled elections. All the campaign money is controlled by parties. The parties select candidates. You don't get to just wake up and say, well, I'm going to name myself a candidate and then let the voters pick. No, parties pick the candidates. And it was that way in this country until several reforms that took place beginning with some in the beginning of the 20th century and then through the 1960s. And also a lot of the financial restrictions on campaign finance also shift power away from political parties and toward the candidates themselves. Parties can't give candidates very much money. Somebody running for office does not get very much money directly from a political party. And with Citizens United versus FEC, we're seeing a lot more money coming from interest groups supporting candidates, not giving money directly to candidates, but supporting them through independent expenditures and sort of bypassing political parties. So parties have actually weakened in time, not strengthened. Now, our system is also characterized by fairly loose discipline in governing. Ideally, when elected officials from the same party go into office, they work together and pass laws and govern, and then voters can look at that and say, well, if the party did what they said they were going to do, they can be rewarded, and if they didn't, they can be punished. But we don't have strongly disciplined people in office, and it's quite often very difficult for political parties to control elected officials and to have a kind of discipline that you would need for a very coordinated effort. What happens in our system is that elected officials stick together only on condition that it helps them get reelected. And if that condition's not met, then they're happy to, kind of thumb their nose at the party and say, well, I'm not gonna vote the party line this time. And we see that this condition is not met sometimes if the local constituents don't agree with the party. They're certainly then gonna vote in a way that's gonna help them get reelected. And we especially see that during periods of divided government. When it's clear that the party itself is not going to be able to pass legislation anyway, then the cost of loose discipline goes down, and it's more easy for elected officials, a particular elected official, to justify to themselves not voting with the party line. Now, I don't want to suggest that we have parties that are not voting along party line right now. We do have parties voting along party line, and that's actually because the local constituents are lining up that way. It's not because the parties are requiring people to vote along party line in the lawmaking process. All right. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about in terms of the elected officials is the fact that we're seeing a pretty dramatic polarization among elected officials. And when we say polarization, we mean that the parties, people in the political parties that are getting elected in the political parties, are to the extreme left or to the extreme right of their political party base. And this is a good picture of this. This is the picture that's in your textbook. This is from 1952, a house. It's a measure of liberal conservative ideology, liberal on this side, conservative on this. And this is from 2012. And you can see that they have moved to the outside, right? And there's no overlap, essentially. Here there's a fair amount of overlap. This little bit right here is what we used to call Rockefeller Republicans. So progressive Republicans, Republicans elected most often from the North, who have ideals that are very similar to the Democratic Party. So these two bits. And in here we have what we might call Dixiecrats, right? Democrats that are getting elected in most cases from their South, whose ideology really matches that of the Republican Party. And so over time, those people have not been reelected. It's not that they have changed their ideology in most cases, it's that they've been replaced by other people who do not hold the kind of mixed ideology, no overlap. So we're seeing pretty dramatic polarization. And we can ask the question, well, why do we see such polarization among those who are elected officials? Three kinds of answers might be given. First off, historically, the sorting that I've talked about in terms of the coalitions, no more Dixiecrats, no more progressive Republicans, but we're also seeing a geographic sorting. So we're seeing people who agree with each other politically moving into the same geographic area. Neighborhoods and regions, entire congressional districts, and sometimes states tend to be people who are more likely to be in one party as opposed to another. There's not as much mixing. Another kind of an answer is the process kind of an answer. We see polarization happening because of the way redistricting works, When maps are drawn around electoral districts, they often favor a particular political party and dampen competition between political parties. But we also see what happens with primary elections. In primary elections, um, strong partisans are overrepresented because people don't vote as much, and strong partisans pick more polarized candidates to send to the general election. I'm going to come back to this and talk about this a little bit more. And the third kind of an answer is that the voters are more polarized, so they elect more polarized officials. This is a pretty robust debate in political science right now, and it's actually going to be the focus of your discussion assignment. You're going to be looking at a couple of articles. One of them is in the syllabus already. This is a study whose results were published at the Pew Center, Political Polarization in the American Public. Okay, and the website, I'll show you the website later. And then you're also going to look at a short article, or fairly easy to read article. It's not actually that short because he covers a lot of different topics, by a guy named Morris Fiorina, who argues that the American public is not really very polarized. And you're going to be looking at these two and having a discussion about it. Now, in the electorate itself, party membership is fairly informal. We just check a box when we go to register to vote. I'm not sure if you've done that before. If you've checked a box, I should say. And party ID is fairly loose in terms of our identification with political parties. We think about 4 different kinds of groups. Strong partisans. These are people who vote regularly, they're registered for a party, they even volunteer and donate money. Makes up about 10% of the electorate. Weak partisans, people registered, but they aren't very active in the party, that's about 20%. People with no party preference at all, about 25%. But this 25% are also what we call leaners. So they almost always vote for one party or another, even though they don't check a party preference when they register. And then we have another fairly small group, true independents, people who are registered to vote, but they don't prefer a party, and they often vote for different parties. This group is quite divided. There's a lot of kind of discussion of this group. Some of them are kind of ideological independents. They just can't find a home in one of the other parties. That's a fairly small percentage of people. A lot of this group are simply are actually low information voters. They're people that pay not quite as much attention to politics as other people do, and their vote ends up being fairly inconsistent from one election to the next. So some of them are very highly informed individuals. Many of them are kind of the opposite of that. And then we have a large group of people who are not registered to vote at all. 35% of the electorate is not registered to vote. That is the second highest in all of the OECD countries. These are the countries that typically are democratic and highly developed economies. Most other countries have most of the electorate is registered to vote. I also want you to think about, have some appreciation for party ID trends in the United States, in California, and in San Diego recently. This is the figure that's in your textbook. The largest group in the country right now are people that don't select any preference for a party. Those are the leaners, right? And other than that, Democrats are second and Republicans are third, right? California is not like the rest of the country. In California, most people are registered as Democrats, and then Republicans, and then no party preference. So we're quite unusual in the country. San Diego's been kind of flipping back and forth for a while. It's a hotly contested part of the country. And if you take a look at a map that's in your California government textbook, there's a map of political parties in California. What you'll see is that there's quite a divide in California. Most of the coastal counties are Democratic, and most of the inland counties are Republican. So we have this divide that goes down the middle of the country, the middle of the state. San Diego, though, is one of those coastal counties that's had for a long time been Republican. They were Republican in 2004. In 2008, they did vote, San Diego County voted for Obama, and then very quickly got back to a situation in 2012 where it was almost neck and neck in terms of voter registration. Since then, voter registration the advantage has gone to Democrats in San Diego. So it's a hotly contested because Republicans want to say, well, this is coastal county. All the coastal counties are not Democratic. And Democrats want to make sure that San Diego stays in their column. So there's a fair amount of activity here in San Diego over that. The current coalitions, Democratic and Republican coalitions, you should be somewhat familiar with this. We've already talked about the ideology chart. Republicans are the ones that tend to be conservative, so they answer this way in the ideology chart. And Democrats tend to answer this way. They tend to be, some of them are liberal. I shouldn't say they tend to be liberal, or these, it's a little more complicated than that. But generally, if you're in the conservative category, you're a Republican. If you're in the liberal category, you're a Democrat. And also make sure that you're aware and remember what I've been talking about in terms of the shift of Southern whites to the Republican Party, and the fact that the sorting takes a fairly long time to take hold. And also be aware of the 4 best predictors of party affiliation. Race, gender, education, and age should be listed here as well. So let me type that in, I forgot. And I'm going to take you to some data that you can find at the Pew Center again, but I'll flash it for you. Actually, oh, that's right, I already put it up here. These are areas in which you see pretty stark division between different groups of people in society. One division has to do with race, and so you see, for instance, when it comes to race, African Americans overwhelmingly vote Democratic, and for white people there's a slight Republican advantage, and that advantage changes when we look at white women, for instance. So gender is another interesting category. So here is what we refer to as the gender gap right here. Women tend to vote Democratic, and this adds in the education gap as well. What we're seeing is that women with a postgraduate education are overwhelmingly Democratic, and so you put those two together, you have this advantage. And we also see, in terms of religion, we see some groups, religious groups, the Mormons, white evangelical Protestants, who tend to be Republican, and Jewish and religiously unaffiliated, who tend to be Democratic. Another way to put this is in terms of religiosity. How religious are you? And so I've seen it reported that way in other places. I think that might actually be a more useful way to think about this. These are groups that tend to be religiously not very active. These tend to be very active religiously, and that's actually, one of the ways that you can cut this divide. And so we're seeing these divisions, and white men, and also white Southerners, tend to be more Republican. This is just a kind of a snapshot. You can take these groups and break them out in different ways, and you see that this kind of an advantage will disappear, not disappear entirely, but begin to be diminished in different ways. But these are some of the most important areas in which we see gaps in a registration for the different parties. And final slide, happiness by party. For a long time, we've taken note of the fact that Republicans tend to report a higher happiness than Democrats and people who are not registered for a party. I can't seem to find any more recent data than 2004. I'm not sure how it would look today.